The frost still slept on the valley that morning, glimmering like crushed glass beneath the pale light of dawn. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the cold breath of the mountains, down to the wooden cabin that stood alone, at the edge of nowhere, hardened by years of silence, scars, and regret. For Hank, mornings were always the same: stoke the fire, boil the coffee, and step outside to face another day in exile. Or so he told himself. He had just stepped onto the porch when he heard it, 3 faint knocks. At first, he thought it was the wind tapping against the wood. But then came a voice, soft and trembling. "Mister, please." Hank froze. No one ever came this far. Not in the dead chill of morning, not through the frost. A little girl, no taller than his waist, stood barefoot in the snow, her small frame wrapped in a torn orange dress, her hair tangled and wild. Her cheeks were red from the cold, eyes wide and wet with tears. She looked up at him like he was the last person left in the world. "They beaten my mama," she whispered, her lips trembling. "She's dying." The words hit Hank like a rifle shot to the chest. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. He had seen enough dying in his lifetime. Men on battlefields, friends buried in dirt, dreams lost to greed. But something in that child's eyes, something pure, desperate, unbroken, wouldn't let him close the door. Without a word, he grabbed his coat and lifted her gently into his arms. "Where?" he asked. She pointed toward the dark edge of the forest, beyond the frozen creek. The wind carried the faint sound of crows and the smell of smoke. Hank followed her directions, his boots crunching through. Frost as the first light began to break over the valley. The forest swallowed them in silence. The girl clung to his arm, her breath shaking against his shoulder. Every step felt heavier, not from the weight of her small body, but from the storm gathering inside him. When they reached the clearing, he saw it, a collapsed shack, smoke rising faintly from the broken chimney. Hank pushed through the door, and the sight before him turned his blood cold. A woman lay on the dirt floor, bruised, battered, her breath shallow and trembling. The smell of blood filled the air. Hank knelt beside her, his voice low but steady. "Who did this?" The woman's cracked lips moved slowly. "Men, from Carter's gang." Hank's eyes darkened. He knew that name, and the past he'd been running from had just come knocking again. That name was a ghost from another life, one he thought he'd buried deep under years of dust and silence. But now it was back, breathing through the bruises of a broken woman and the terrified eyes of her child. He tore a strip from his flannel shirt and pressed it against her wound. The woman winced, a faint groan escaping her lips. "Stay still," Hank muttered, his voice steady but tight. "You're safe now." The girl, Lucy, as he would soon learn, knelt beside her mother, clutching her hand. Her small fingers were cold as ice, trembling against the woman's skin. "Mama, please don't go to sleep," she whispered, tears cutting tiny rivers through the dirt on her cheeks. Hank glanced at the door, then back to the forest. The silence outside wasn't peace. It was the kind that comes before danger. He could feel it in the air, the way animals feel a storm before it hits. "Come on, kid," he said. "We're getting out of here." The walk back was slow, the frost crunching beneath his boots, the early light crawling over the horizon like a shy flame. Every few steps, she looked over her shoulder, afraid the men who hurt her mother would come charging out of the trees. When they reached the cabin, Hank laid the woman on his bed, near the fire. The warmth brought a faint color back to her face. He cleaned her wounds, wrapped them with what he had, and fed her drops of water from a tin cup. The girl sat quietly by the bedside, clutching her mother's hand, refusing to blink. Hours passed. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering things Hank couldn't quite catch, names, apologies, prayers. Lucy's head drooped against the blanket, exhaustion finally pulling her under. Hank stood by the window, looking out at the endless forest. The sunlight had broken through now, washing the frost in gold, but the peace felt fragile. He turned back to the fire, his jaw set. But now, with that little girl, asleep in his cabin and the woman's life flickering in his hands, he knew there was no choice. The moment he picked up his old rifle from above the fireplace, the past came alive again, every scar, every wound, every loss. Outside, a crow screamed in the distance. Hank's eyes narrowed. The storm was coming, and this time, he wasn't running. The sun was already sinking behind the ridge when Hank stepped outside again. The air had that heavy stillness that only comes before trouble, a silence too deep, too deliberate. He stood on the porch, staring out over the frost-covered valley. In the fading light, even the pines seemed to hold their breath. He lit a lantern and hung it by the door. Inside the cabin, Lucy slept curled beside her mother, her small hand still clutching the woman's arm. The steady crackle of the fire was the only sound that reminded. Hank life still pulsed inside those walls. Only 7 left. It would have to do. His hands were steady, too steady for a man who'd sworn never to fight again. As night fell, the world outside turned to shadow and silver. Maybe 6, weaving slowly through the trees on horseback. His chest tightened. Carter's men. He stepped back inside and shut the door softly. The woman stirred, whispering something he couldn't make out. He leaned close and caught a single word, "Run." Hank shook his head. "Ain't running anymore." He doused the lantern, plunging the cabin into half-darkness. From the window, he could see the torches drawing closer, their voices faint and cruel. "Looks like the woman didn't crawl far," one said. Another laughed. "Boss'll be pleased. We'll finish the job quick." Hank's grip tightened on the rifle. He'd buried too many people because he waited too long to act. Not tonight. The torches bobbed closer, the riders' shapes now clear against the snow. The cold bit into his skin, but he didn't move. Every sense sharpened, every muscle remembered. When the first rider crossed the frozen creek, Hank exhaled slowly, steady as a prayer. Crack! The rifle's echo thundered through the valley. The first torch hit the ground, snuffed out in the snow. Horses screamed, men shouted. Chaos broke the stillness. Then, silence again. Only the wind, whispering through the trees. He waited, breath clouding in the cold. The girl whimpered inside. He turned, whispering through the door, "It's all right, Lucy. I'm here." But even as he said it, he knew this was only the beginning. Carter would hear, and when he did, he'd come himself. The past was awake now, and it was coming for him. Smoke from the rifle still drifted through the cold air when Hank stepped back inside. His boots left trails of snow on the cabin floor. Lucy stirred, her eyes wide with fear. "Mister, are they gone?" she whispered. He knelt beside her and brushed the hair from her face. "For now," he said softly, "but more will come." Her mother's breathing was shallow, barely there. The firelight trembled over her bruised face. Hank placed a damp cloth on her forehead, his jaw tightening as he watched her struggle for air. He could see the fight leaving her, and it twisted something deep inside him. He stood and stared into the fire, the flames dancing like ghosts. "Carter," he muttered under his breath, the name burning in his mouth like ash. He remembered the man well, once his closest friend, now a monster who'd built his power on fear. Years ago, they'd shared dreams of building this valley together. But greed had changed Carter. When Hank walked away from that life, Carter filled the void with violence. And now, his cruelty had found its way to Hank's doorstep. Hank loaded his last few bullets and stepped out onto the porch once more. The night was quiet again, too quiet. The torches that had fallen in the snow now smoldered like dying stars. Somewhere beyond the ridge, wolves howled, drawn by the scent of blood. He scanned the tree line, every sense alert. A shadow moved, a lone rider, watching from the distance. The moonlight caught the glint of a rifle slung across his shoulder. Then the rider turned and disappeared into the forest. A scout. Hank's pulse steadied. "So, Carter knows now," he murmured. "Good." He went back inside, closing the door behind him. The wind rattled the windows, the old wood creaking like it remembered fear. Hank sat near the fire, cleaning his rifle with deliberate calm. Lucy watched him, her small voice breaking the silence. "Will they hurt us again?" He looked at her, his eyes softening. "Not if I can help it." She nodded slowly, then crawled closer to her mother. Hank watched them for a long while, the flicker of the fire casting their shadows against the walls, fragile, yet unyielding. Then he spoke quietly, more to himself than anyone. "I walked away from this fight once, but not again. Not while that man breathes." Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying the echo of his vow across the frozen valley. The cabin stood alone, one man, one child, one fading life inside, but there was something different now. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt like waiting. And in that waiting, Hank Lawson, the man who once ran from everything, had found a reason to stand again. The storm was coming, and this time, he was ready to meet it head-on. The first light of dawn crept over the valley like a blade cutting through fog. Frost still blanketed the ground, glittering beneath the faint sun, but the air carried a new sound, the distant thunder of hooves. Hank Lawson was already awake. He hadn't slept. He sat at the small table near the fire, staring at the rifle laid before him, the metal cleaned, the wood polished like an old friend ready for one last fight. Outside, the wind was still. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Lucy slept beside her mother, wrapped in an old wool blanket. Her face was pale, peaceful in the faint glow of the fire. The woman's breathing had grown weaker through the night, her body cold despite the heat of the flames. Hank had done all he could. Now, only time and fate had the final say. Then, the sound came closer. Hooves, voices, laughter. Hank rose slowly and looked through the frosted window. Down the ridge, 5 riders emerged from the mist, their silhouettes sharp against the morning sun. At their head rode a man in a long black coat, Carter. Even from this distance, Hank could feel the man's presence, cold, confident, cruel. He tightened his grip on the rifle and whispered, "You finally came." The horses stopped near the creek, steam rising from their nostrils. Carter dismounted, brushing the dust from his coat, and shouted toward the cabin, "Lawson, you've got something of mine. Send her out, and maybe I'll let you keep your skin." Hank opened the door slowly and stepped onto the porch. The rising sun painted his broad frame in gold and shadow. He looked down the hill, his voice calm but cold. "You took everything from her already. You ain't taking what's left." Carter laughed, a low, ugly sound that echoed through the valley. "Still playing the hero, huh? You should have stayed dead when you walked away." Hank raised the rifle slightly. "I tried, but the past keeps knocking." The tension between them was electric. 2 men bound by old wounds, old sins, and a woman who once stood between them. The other riders fanned out, surrounding the cabin like wolves closing in on their prey. Inside, Lucy stirred awake and ran to the window. Her small hands pressed to the glass. "Mr. Hank," she whispered, voice trembling. Hank didn't turn. His eyes stayed on Carter. "You got one chance," he said flatly. "Leave." Carter smiled, the kind of smile that carried no soul. "You know I don't do mercy." The first gunshot shattered the stillness of morning. The battle for the valley, and for redemption, had begun.